The summer had settled into that heavy humming rhythm where cicadas filled the air with their constant buzz, and the smell of barbecue seemed to drift lazily through neighborhoods like a reminder of weekends, friends, and freedom. For the homeowner, grilling wasn't simply an occasional activity, it was ritual. The backyard had been carefully arranged with a wide smoker, a trusty old charcoal grill, a stack of wood that carried the earthy scent of hickory and mesquite, and a patio built for company. Friends knew Saturdays meant ribs, Sundays meant brisket, and if the mood was right, maybe a midweek evening burger cookout under the fading orange light of sunset. At first, it was nothing more than small gatherings. A few neighbors leaning on the fence, sipping cold drinks, plates of steaming ribs passed around, while laughter bubbled up louder than the cicadas. The smell carried across the street, through the cul-de-sacs, wrapping itself around identical beige houses, like an invitation. Children wandered over, their eyes lighting up as they clutched hot dogs in buns. It was simple, joyful, and deeply human, an antidote to the sameness of a neighborhood policed by endless rules and regulations. But in every story like this, there was always one person who couldn't stand the joy. Her name was whispered among neighbors with rolled eyes and heavy sighs. She carried herself with clipped efficiency, her hair always perfect, her posture stiff as if she were carved from stone. She saw the world in terms of regulations, violations, and infractions. And to her, the drifting smell of smoked ribs wasn't a sign of community or comfort. It was, in her words, pollution, her. The first complaint came in a letter, slipped into the mailbox, typed in cold formality, signed with her name. She cited disturbances, excessive noise, and unpleasant odors. The homeowner read it once, then set it aside, chuckling to himself. After all, who could hate barbecue? Surely it was just bluster, a one-off protest, something that would blow over. But it didn't blow over. The next weekend, as smoke curled once again over the fence, and the sweet tang of sauce mingled with sizzling meat, she marched across the lawn, snapping photos, her face twisted in exaggerated disgust. She stood just far enough away not to be considered trespassing, but close enough that her disapproval became part of the atmosphere. Neighbors rolled their eyes and turned their backs to her. Children ducked away, whispering about the mean lady with the clipboard. Her complaints grew bolder. She called the local housing board, filed noise reports with the city, and sent letters demanding an end to unsanctioned mass gatherings. Every weekend that the grill was lit, she seemed to grow angrier, her protests louder. Yet the gatherings also seemed to grow. What started as a handful of neighbors became dozens. Word spread. People loved the food, the music, the sense of freedom in a neighborhood otherwise chained by rules. Some began bringing their own dishes, potato salads, homemade pies, trays of cornbread. Others offered to pitch in for more charcoal or to help set up tables. The backyard that once held a single grill was now an impromptu party ground. A canopy was set up to shield food from the sun. Folding chairs spilled out onto the grass. Lanterns hung from the trees glowed as night came on, making the whole place shimmer like a festival. And always, through it all, the neighbor stood watch, filing her reports, muttering about violations, sending yet another stack of typed letters. But something strange began to happen. Her efforts, intended to shut everything down, had the opposite effect. The more she complained, the more determined the neighbors became to show up. The gatherings transformed from casual cookouts into subtle acts of defiance, a declaration that joy couldn't be stifled by one person's bitterness. It didn't take long before the story of the backyard barbecues reached beyond the neighborhood. Photos found their way onto local Facebook groups. Someone filmed a short video of ribs being pulled from the smoker, steam rising like a slow dance, while music played and children darted between tables. The clip went viral in the city, drawing curious visitors who drove in from other blocks, other suburbs, eager to see what all the fuss was about. Of course, this only made the angry neighbor escalate. She began parking her car deliberately across the street during the cookouts, honking loudly when people walked by. She planted signs in her yard about health hazards and community standards, but her protests were drowned out by music, by laughter, by the clatter of plates and the hiss of meat on the grill. As the weeks passed, the cookouts became a fixture, a tradition. They were penciled onto calendars, whispered about in carpool lines, and looked forward to with anticipation. The smell of ribs became not just the scent of smoked meat, but the smell of rebellion, of freedom, of community choosing joy over rules. But there was always the sense that something larger was coming. The neighbor, for all her fuming, was persistent. She was the type who didn't just complain for the sake of it. She wanted results, control, victory. Her complaints had already reached the city offices, and soon there were whispers that she was preparing something bigger, perhaps a legal challenge, perhaps a campaign to have the cookouts officially banned. For now, though, the homeowner stood by his grill, tongs in hand, watching smoke curl into the sky. Children laughed, music played, plates piled high with food disappeared into happy hands. He knew the storm was coming, but for the moment there was peace, warmth, and the undeniable joy of barbecue. The neighbor watched from her window, her expression a tight knot of fury. The glow of lanterns danced across her glass, mocking her with every flicker. She was already planning her next move, already sharpening her complaints into weapons. The cookouts had grown from a hobby into something bigger, something symbolic, and she wasn't about to let that stand. The homeowner, though, had no intention of backing down. This was only the beginning. By the time summer reached its peak, the weekend cookouts had transformed from backyard gatherings into full-blown neighborhood events. What had begun as a few folding chairs and the smell of ribs curling through the air was now something closer to a festival. Cars lined the street every Saturday, lawn chairs were dragged across sidewalks, tables groaned under the weight of potluck dishes. Lanterns, fairy lights, and even a few borrowed speakers turned the backyard into a glowing, music-filled arena that could rival a city block party. The neighbor who had set this story in motion, the one who could not stand the smell of ribs or the sound of laughter, was losing her battle in spirit but not in persistence. Each week she appeared with new methods of protest, each one escalating in desperation. She took videos of smoke drifting over the fence, narrating them with exaggerated coughs. She scribbled down license plate numbers of visitors as if building a case file. She even began leaving long-winded notes under windshield wipers, claiming guests were trespassing, though everyone knew they were simply parked on public streets. But while her efforts grew shriller, the community's response only became stronger. Instead of feeling shamed or intimidated, people laughed off her antics. If anything, her outrage fueled attendance. It became part of the fun. Children imitated her angry gestures while holding hot dogs. Adults joked about adding a complaint jar next to the drink cooler, where people could toss coins every time she glared out her window. What she had hoped would silence the cookouts was instead cementing them as a tradition. The homeowner, though amused, knew there was a storm brewing. The letters that once came typed and hand-delivered were now arriving on official letterhead. The city's noise ordnance office had received multiple complaints, and inspectors were dispatched. One afternoon, 2 officials arrived in bright vests, clipboards in hand, their expressions caught between duty and disbelief as they surveyed the scene. What they found wasn't chaos or disorder. It was a neighborhood gathering, orderly, clean, and shockingly polite. Children played in a corner, music hummed at a controlled level. Trash bins stood neatly labeled for recycling and compost. Plates and utensils were stacked for easy disposal. The inspectors left with little more than notes and photographs, muttering about compliance, but the point had been made. The cookouts were now officially on record. The neighbor's campaign escalated again. She began attending HOA meetings with a fiery determination, brandishing photos, videos, and reports. She claimed the cookouts lowered property values, endangered health, and violated community spirit. She demanded action, demanded fines, demanded restrictions. The HOA board, weary of her relentless persistence, begrudgingly opened an investigation. Notices were mailed out, warning of unauthorized mass events, potential fire hazards, and nuisance activity. But here was the twist. By now, the cookouts weren't just neighborhood gossip. They had become local news. A short video filmed by a visitor had gone viral on TikTok. It showed ribs being pulled slowly from a smoker, juices glistening under the sunlight as a crowd erupted in cheers. In the background, lanterns twinkled, children laughed, and a banner someone had made jokingly read, "The free BBQ resistance." The video was shared thousands of times, captioned with phrases like, "This is how you fight back against HOA tyranny," and "The ribs smell like freedom." Soon reporters came knocking. Local newspapers ran cheerful stories about the backyard pitmaster bringing the neighborhood together. Photos of sizzling brisket appeared in weekend food sections. A radio station broadcasted live one Saturday, their van parked across the street, the host grinning as he bit into a rib and declared it the best he'd ever had. The cookouts had shifted from local gathering to citywide sensation, and all the while the neighbor fumed. Her fury became legendary. She hissed at reporters, blocked cameras with her hands, and shouted about property values into microphones that no one wanted to hold near her. If the cookouts had started as rebellion, they were now a movement, and she was the unwilling villain at the center of it all. The homeowner watched the spectacle grow with a mix of amusement and caution. He knew that fame came with scrutiny. Each weekend was carefully organized to ensure compliance. Noise levels were monitored, trash collected, and safety taken seriously. Yet the attention only seemed to make the neighbor more determined. She hired her own lawyer, filing motions and threatening lawsuits. She demanded city council hearings. She claimed her quality of life had been destroyed by the smell of smoked meat, but reality told a different story. Local businesses began sponsoring the cookouts. A butcher donated cuts of meat in exchange for a banner near the smoker. A bakery brought trays of rolls. Even a brewery offered kegs at cost, their logo proudly displayed on cups. What had begun as rebellion had blossomed into community tradition, then into cultural event, and then came the tipping point. One Saturday evening, as the lanterns glowed and a crowd of nearly 200 filled the yard and street, a drone camera hovered overhead. The footage captured the scene from above, tables lit by strings of light, plumes of smoke rising like incense, children weaving between chairs, adults laughing, eating, celebrating. The video spread online, and within a week it had reached millions. Suddenly, the cookouts weren't just a local story, they were national. News anchors chuckled through segments, marveling at the spectacle of one angry neighbor inspiring the largest backyard barbecue in the state. The neighbor was no longer just furious. She was humiliated. She had wanted silence and order. Instead, she had become a punchline, the symbol of pettiness, the caricature of control. Memes with her face superimposed onto signs that read, "No ribs allowed," spread across social media. Children made TikToks mocking her angry glares. Even city officials seemed to quietly roll their eyes when she appeared at council meetings, still railing about smoke hazards and unpermitted gatherings. Yet despite the laughter, the conflict was far from over. The neighbor, though humiliated, was relentless. She had taken her case to higher authorities, filing formal complaints with state regulators. She wasn't done fighting, not by a long shot, and as the cookouts grew bigger, more beloved and more famous, the question lingered: what would happen when her war reached its peak? The homeowner knew one thing for certain: he wasn't going to stop. The cookouts were no longer just about food or fun. They had become about principle, about community, about standing against the suffocating grip of rules meant to strangle joy. The smell of ribs drifted through the air again that evening, wrapping itself around the block like a promise. Children laughed, lanterns glowed, and the neighbor's blinds snapped shut as she scribbled yet another complaint. The battle was reaching its climax. The weeks rolled by, and what had begun as a single act of defiance had now blossomed into something far larger than anyone could have predicted. The neighborhood cookouts had evolved into a rhythm, a heartbeat that pulsed through the streets every weekend. Families marked their calendars, children counted down the days, and even strangers from nearby communities began to drop by just to be part of the growing tradition. The smell of barbecue had transformed from a point of contention into a symbol of unity, spreading through the air like a warm invitation no one could resist. The once quiet cul-de-sac was now a gathering place, alive with laughter, music, and the unmistakable aroma of smoked ribs and grilled corn. Folding chairs lined the sidewalks, coolers brimmed with sodas and iced tea, and the sound of chatter mixed with the hum of grills burning late into the night. It wasn't just about food anymore. The cookouts had become a movement, one that pushed back against rules that felt cold and overbearing. People no longer saw them as parties. They saw them as freedom. Yet for every person who embraced the change, there were those who resisted. Karen had not disappeared into the background. If anything, her determination grew sharper with every gathering. She filed more reports with the HOA, logging each weekend as a violation of noise ordinances, property regulations, and neighborhood standards. She documented photographs of overflowing trash bags, cars parked slightly askew on the street, and smoke drifting too far into her own yard. She complained that the scent clung to her curtains, that it settled into her hair, that it made her home unlivable. But despite her constant pushback, something unexpected was happening. The HOA, once quick to issue warnings and citations, found itself overwhelmed. Each letter of complaint Karen sent was met with a flood of counter-letters from neighbors praising the cookouts. The HOA inbox, once filled with grievances, now brimmed with testimonies of community, friendship, and pride. Families wrote about how the gatherings had helped them feel closer. Elderly residents explained how the events had lifted their loneliness. Young parents shared how their kids had found friends. The HOA board, caught in the crossfire, no longer had a simple answer. The tension, however, did not ease. Karen doubled down, hiring a lawyer to argue that the cookouts created a public nuisance. She sent cease and desist letters, pinned notices on light poles, and even tried calling the police to shut down one of the larger evenings. Yet each attempt seemed to backfire. Officers arrived only to find peaceful families sitting around picnic tables, children playing tag, and grills manned by volunteers wearing aprons. There was no disorder, no chaos, nothing to justify shutting anything down. Slowly but surely, Karen's efforts began to look less like protection of the neighborhood and more like an obsession. As the weeks passed, the cookouts expanded beyond the block. People began to bring their own grills, their own recipes, and their own traditions. One neighbor set up a smoker so large it could cook an entire pig. Another family started offering homemade pies. Musicians brought guitars and tambourines, filling the evenings with folk songs and impromptu dancing. What had once been a single driveway event now stretched across yards, down sidewalks, and into the park nearby. The block became a festival ground, glowing with string lights and buzzing with excitement. The sense of transformation was undeniable. Property values began to rise, not because the HOA enforced its rules, but because people wanted to live near the cookout culture. Homes sold faster, families sought to move in, and the neighborhood gained a reputation as the most welcoming street in the city. Articles appeared in local newspapers praising the cookout community. Photos of the gatherings circulated online, showing long tables of smiling neighbors raising plates of ribs and corn in celebration. What had started as Karen's attempt to end one man's weekend barbecue had grown into a citywide sensation. But even as the neighborhood gained recognition, Karen refused to let go. She stood at her windows, arms folded, watching crowds file into the street. She sent angry messages to city officials, accusing them of allowing disorder. She tried to shame the neighborhood in online forums, claiming it was a hazard and a disgrace, yet each complaint only strengthened the unity of the cookout. Neighbors who had once barely waved to each other now bonded over her attempts to tear them apart. They became fiercely protective of the gatherings, ensuring that no single person could ever stop them. In the end, the story of the cookouts wasn't about food or smoke or noise. It was about resilience. It was about how a neighborhood chose to rise above bitterness and hostility, to replace isolation with connection, and to take something small and turn it into something unstoppable. The cookouts became more than a rebellion against an unreasonable complaint. They became a legacy. Karen's name was still whispered, but not with the fear or authority she had once carried. Instead, it was spoken almost like a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when one person stands against the tide of community. And as the grills continued to fire, as the smell of smoked ribs rolled down the block and laughter filled the night air, it became clear that the neighborhood had chosen its future. The HOA, facing overwhelming support from residents, eventually revised its own guidelines. They made allowances for gatherings, clarified parking rules, and acknowledged the importance of community events. It was not the victory Karen wanted, but it was the victory the neighborhood needed. The cookouts had not only survived, They had changed the very rules that sought to end them. As the final embers of one evening's fire burned low and families packed up their tables and chairs, a sense of peace settled over the block. The cookouts would continue, week after week, year after year, and the story of how one complaint sparked a movement would live on. What began as a fight against the smell of ribs had turned into something greater, something no HOA policy could ever erase. And so the neighborhood closed its chapter of conflict, not with silence but with the sound of sizzling grills, clinking glasses, and the laughter of a community that had found its heart.